Hi everybody. In this video, I want to just share a small article I wrote relating to some information about inflation, which is the chapter we're going to be coming up on next. So inflation, monetary policy, which is another chapter coming up very soon, and how COVID has been affecting some of the things in this area. So the next few chapters we have going on are inflation, the money and banking system, the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve who conducts monetary policy. And so, just real quick, inflation, which we're going to start next, is essentially the price level in an economy. We've talked about it before a bit because it's quite related to other concepts we've been talking about when we compare real GDP versus nominal GDP, and also this bit of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation that we've talked about. So we're going to dive in heavily into inflation. I'll mention a couple things about inflation in this article, and in general, the money and banking system and monetary policy. So I'm just going to say a few things about this, but I encourage you to read the entire article because we'll also have some quiz questions and test questions relating to this in addition to the lecture notes themselves. I'll just show you the graphs and talk a little bit about some of the things I'm discussing in the graphs. This first one is the federal funds rate, and we're going to talk about this once we talk about monetary policy. But essentially, it's the baseline interest rate in the economy which the Federal Reserve sets. And for, I guess, our purposes for now, I just want to mention one thing about the interest rate in the economy. So remember, as we've talked about before, all of these gray bars are recessions. And in all the recessions since 1970, we've had nearly or at least a 5% drop in the interest rate. So here we're going from about 9 down to about, let's call it 3. So about a 6% drop. Here, a 6 or 7% drop. Here we have a big drop, nearly 20 down to little less than 20 to a little less than 10, minus 10. So all of these dropping by at least 5%, here going from about 5 to about 0. And so then this last one, we're starting at 2.5, but the problem is we don't have 5% to drop because otherwise interest rates would go negative. And so the traditional monetary policy, which we'll be discussing in class, doesn't really work as it would have previously. And let me just point out that the whole idea behind this interest rate thing, if R is the interest rate, the Federal Reserve pushes down the interest rate, so that makes borrowing is now cheaper. So interest rate is lower, means it's cheaper to buy a house, it's cheaper to buy a car with credit. So consumption goes up and investment goes up, and those are parts of GDP, so GDP goes up. So that's this idea of kind of monetary stimulus to prop up the economy when it's going poorly by making it cheaper to borrow to increase two of those components of GDP. So that's what the Federal Reserve is trying to do, but again, they don't have all of that room to do it this time, so they're doing some different types of monetary policy this time around. Typically, when the Fed is conducting monetary policy, they have the Fed has all this money, and you have institutional investors with loans. Let's say an IOU from the government. So a government loan, a whole bunch of these, and the Fed buys them. And when the Fed does this, the Fed is increasing their assets. These are just loans, which are part of the Fed's assets. and in exchange, they're pushing money out into the economy. And we'll talk about how this increase in the money supply will theoretically lower that interest rate, push down the interest rate, and stimulate growth. So when the Fed buys all of these loans, their assets are going up. This happened a lot in the Great Recession after the housing crisis. It's happening a lot now as well. Typically, the risk of all of this that a lot of economists had in their mind was that as we have this black line here increasing, that's the Fed assets going up, there's a risk of inflation in the economy. So if you push too much money into the economy, now people start spending that money. When people spend money, prices go up, and when prices go up, that's the definition of inflation. So by the Federal Reserve releasing lots of money out into the economy, there's a risk of inflation. But as we can see here, this red line, which uses this axis over to the right, we basically had, less than 3%, but even a lot of times less than 2% inflation for the entire last decade, even after the Fed bought a whole bunch of these assets and released money into the economy. So we didn't see the extremely large levels of inflation that some economists predicted. And we have basically the same question now. As the Fed assets are growing and we have an increasing money supply in the economy, are we going to see that inflation, or is it just going to continue to look like it has for the last 10 years? And so basically the rest of the article gives two scenarios. One for some risks of deflation, where the price levels go down, and one with a risk of inflation, where the price levels go up. And so these are topics we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this downward spiral of deflation, where if the price level starts dropping, then firms have to either lay off workers or decrease their pay because there's no demand in the economy. If worker pay goes down, the workers then have less demand for goods in the economy. If demand goes down, the price goes down, and firms have to lay off or cut pay of even more people, and that's why we get this downward spiral. So that's always a possibility in a recession. It's something that the Federal Reserve tries to avoid, partially through this 2% inflation target. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why inflation is targeted at 2% instead of 0%, which is partially related to this risk of deflation. We'll talk about some other reasons there. And then we'll talk about why there could potentially be some unexpectedly high inflation. And that's going to come back to this idea of the monetary system, the money supply. We have some different definitions of the money supply. So M1 money supply, M2 money supply. We're going to talk about what all of that means and how that's looked over the last couple of recessions. And so I encourage you to go out there, look at this article. I did a little bit of an update to it after the last Federal Reserve policy meeting, which could potentially increase the chances of higher inflation than expected. But yeah, check it out. I'll have a very short and simple reading quiz related to this video and to the article, and otherwise that should be it, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks.